Okay, so thanks so much everyone for being here and for making it all the way to the end of this series. This panel is entitled Reparations Within and Beyond the Law, and I'm going to get straight to it. So our moderator, our discussant today is Aparna Gopalan. She's a doctoral candidate in social anthropology at Harvard University, and her research focuses on ongoing poverty alleviation and development projects in rural Western India. So I'm going to pass over to you, Aparna. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I just wanted to, before we get started, just say a brief word about the ongoing disastrous situation in India, which is where I'm from. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the news. Things are worse than what they look like. And I've personally spoken to people in the US and beyond about ways to help. There's obviously mutual aid efforts, but there's just also the kind of promise to pay attention, both now and in the future, which is probably a greater act of solidarity than many would realize. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that and bring that up because that's something that's been on my mind. Okay, and with that, we can get started. I'm gonna begin by introducing our first speaker, Anna. So Anna Kirsten Shirey is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Anthropology and at Columbia, and a certificate fellow with the Institute for Study of Human Rights at Columbia. Her dissertation focuses on racial exclusion in international law and multi-scalar claims to redress for transatlantic slavery and Native genocide. Her dissertation project has been supported by the Werner Gren Foundation and the NSF from the Cultural Anthropology and Law and Social Science programs. And she is currently developing her next project on affective diplomacy and the colonial origins of neutrality politics in Scandinavia. So I'm going to pass it along to Anna, and just wanted to mention that after our panelists have all spoken, we'll have time for some questions from the audience. So you should see a Q&A box on your screen where you can submit questions for me to read aloud at the end, and we may not get to all the questions, but we will try our best. So with that, I'll pass it to Anna.
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you also for mentioning India and what's going on there. We greatly appreciate it. Hello to everyone out there, all of those that I know. So Kei Shang has promised to help me with the PowerPoints because the interface of Zoom is not very functional. So you will bear with me saying PowerPoint next slide throughout the talk. So it is lovely to be on the presenting end of the table for this last session today. This afternoon, I will explain an argument that I make in my dissertation framed around a concept that I call reparative reason. And I welcome any suggestions and comments that you may have, as I am still early-ish in my writing. So in my research on state responsibility for historical injustices, I have found that claims to reparations for transatlantic slavery have both international and national implications. Next slide. In other words, reparation claims or claims to redress, I use the two expressions interchangeably today, occur at multiple levels. They are entangled in distinct legal contexts, and they have different social and political connotations across organizational scales. Reparation claims then operate in different ways that are particular to their place of enunciation. And as such, a claim to reparations for slavery and Native genocide articulated at a regional level may look very different from a claim to reparations articulated on a local national level. Next slide, please. Direct or indirect recipients of reparation claims and beneficiaries of transatlantic slavery, I argue, should reckon with the specific place of enunciation of reparation claims in the Caribbean today. Reparative reason sustains an ethnographic account of the material implications of reparation claims and solidifies the notion that claims to redress are not only a moral, but also a material imperative. Next slide. In my current project, I thus argue that an analytic of reparative reason can help to concretize the particular terms of each claim. The term reparative reason furthermore contributes to a gap, especially in legal anthropological literature, in historical materialist-oriented ethnographic inquiries into claims for reparations for slavery. At a time of scholarly and popular concern over global anti-Black violence, reparative reason has implications, I hope, for how scholars in the social sciences and international law ethically comprehend the ongoing social and material legacies of transatlantic slavery within and beyond international law. Next slide, please. In the Anglophone Caribbean, as I will suggest today, different articulations of claims to reparations converge on a question of debt. Whether a claim raised and articulated by a regional multi-state organization such as the Caribbean Community CARICOM, or a national civil society organization such as the Guyana Reparations Committee, or more informal claims, they share in common that they all operate within a broader logic of debt. Next slide, please. I want to show how in Guyana, reparation claims also operating within a broader logic of debt diverge around notions of development and land. This divergence offsets a new set of questions related to histories of native dispossession, sovereignty, and enslavement in the region. This convergence divergence speak to ways in which the injuries that reparation claims address, how they transform, expand, and adjust to their social, political, and legal contexts. I will come back to this debt convergence and land development divergence. In my current project, I argue that an analytic of reparative reason can help to concretize the particular terms of each claim. Next slide. The Caribbean is an interesting point of entry for considering transnational claims to reparations because those in position of power are themselves, at least periodically, descendants of enslaved. And I say periodically because in a place like Guyana, for example, the two dominant political parties are divided along ethnic lines, mainly Indo-Guyanese, descendants of Indian indentured laborers, and Afro-Guyanese, descendants of enslaved persons. This historically constructed ethnic heterogeneity has further implications for how we think about the CARICOM claim as a claim that seeks to address quote unquote colonialism more broadly, including native genocide, transatlantic slavery, and Indian indentureship. Inhabiting the multifaceted and mobile social worlds of reparation claims, reparative reason reckons with the ramification of harms caused by transatlantic slavery. The term seeks to address the variegating demands across organizational scales to legally account for the multiple forms of harms and injuries and their structuring effects. Next slide, please. Post-colonial Caribbean sovereignties, nation states, nevertheless, are seeking institutional means to assert claims upon Western European former colonizers. Simultaneously, these states are held accountable by local populations to redress the historical harms perpetuated by their colonial predecessors, such as Great Britain, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, among others. Next slide, please. Transnational in kind, reparation claims travel across organizational scales, and they involve different legal and political frameworks drawing from domestic law and international law. Similarly, the historical and ongoing harms they seek to address multiply in the absence of adequate responses from Western European recipients of the claims. Reparation claims, in other words, requires responsibility and an account of harm on multiple national and international levels and speak to a variety of legal regimes and political contexts. Next slide, please. In Guyana, the specific focus of my research, there are two sorts of claim at stake in the project of post-slavery reparations. One claim, articulated by the regionally representative CARICOM, is a state-driven and internationally oriented claim for redress for transatlantic slavery and native genocide addressed to the former European colonizing powers. Next slide, please. The reparative reason of this claim is structured around the notion of development. Articulating a larger logic of debt through the idiom of development corresponds to a broader diplomatic logic of the state-led claim. This diplomatic logic must be understood in the political context of international relations and customs of diplomacy. Next slide, please. The other claim, articulated by citizen subjects of African descent in Guyana, is a popular national demand for ancestral rights to land addressed to the Guyanese nation state. Here, the reparatory reason is structured around a question of land and labor, classic Marxist objects of analysis. Focusing on ancestral rights to land, it questions the exclusive prerogative of indigenous land title in the country. Next slide, please. Both the international state-led CARICOM claim and the National Guyana Reparations Committee's claim are framed within a larger notion of a transnational and transhistorical debt, and they are intergenerational in that they address harms that have involved and affected numerous generations. A notion of debt is the overarching reparative logic animating various forms of claims for reparations for transatlantic slavery in the Caribbean, but also in the US, in the African continent, and elsewhere in the African diaspora. This reasoning with debt follows from an argument on the global economics of New World slavery and specifically its role in financing industrial and racial capitalism in Europe. There are a number of crucial legal political analyses of the question of debt. One of them was proposed in this webinar series a few weeks back by Vasuki Neshia, who reconceptualized a notion of debt as odious debt. Kin to odious debt is debt as theft, which is where I will go next. To Joanne Scott Lewis, Western European disavowal of reparation claims from the Caribbean, disavowal and disregard for the idea of not just a moral, but of a material debt, constitutes an ongoing act of debt deferral in Western Europe, deferral meaning willfully delayed or postponed. Next slide, please. Scott Lewis interprets reciprocity in the classic anthropological work on gift giving, understanding gifting as the theft of the labor of enslaved Africans. Scott Lewis writes, quote, reparations claims speak to the gifting of Western benefits by Black subjects, thereby turning a Western white taking into Black giving, unquote. The idea here is that slavery was made possible by the theft and subsequent enslavement of people in the African continent. Scott Lewis configures the material profits that this violation generated as the gift that Western colonizing states received from Black enslaved persons and that heirs of colonizing states continue to benefit from today. Next slide, please. While claims to reparations in the Caribbean are framed within a larger logic of debt, Western European nation states respond to this logic of debt through ongoing acts of debt deferral. It is within this context of deferral that we may understand CARICOM state representatives' turn to an idiom of development as a diplomatic maneuver. Since the formal launch of the 2013 CARICOM claim, various state officials from the region have addressed the idea of reparations from former Western European colonizing states through the idiom of development. Next slide, please. In the example I point out today, Prime Minister of Barbados and then outgoing chair of the CARICOM Prime Ministerial Subcommittee of Reparations, Mia Mottley, in the summer of 2020, discussed a, quote, international development compact, unquote, drawing on a post-World War II development ethics in calling for the equivalent of a, quote, Caribbean Marshall Plan, unquote. Mottley said, the reality is that we were not given a development compact that allowed us to be able to move on. We were given political independence. The scale that would lead to transformation depends on an international compact for the Caribbean. I have over the last few months talked about the equivalent of a Caribbean Marshall Plan. The US Marshall Plan of 1948 did not emerge in the context of a claim to a debt between the US and Western Europe. And as a configuration of aid, it came with territorial interests. Thus, a direct comparison between the two might not seem viable. Another way, however, to interpret Prime Minister Mottley's reference to a Marshall Plan is to highlight the Prime Minister's indirect, indeed diplomatic, reminder to Western Europe of a moment in time in which this region in particular took the position of receiving aid. Next slide, please. Such an interpretation of Prime Minister Mottley's reference to a Marshall Plan acknowledges Western European nation states as recipients of aid and recognizes the necessity of recovery programs for a war-torn region to restore its post-conflict fallen infrastructures. Next slide, please. Interpreting Motley's reference to a Marshall Plan this way can illuminate what I will refer to as a diplomatic maneuver, i.e. addressing a contentious subject of reparations in a diplomatically tactful manner, as it were, or rather in a manner that curtails the potential discomfort of the so-called Western European debtor nations being directly addressed as such. Note that Motley does not speak of the demand through an idiom of debt that is owed, but identifies a historical moment in which Western Europe was on the receiving end of aid. This does not mean that the debt does not exist. Motley, however, appeals to the possibility of a mutual experience of having been in a place of need between the Caribbean and Western Europe. Next slide. Motley then is balancing the diplomatic dilemma that is at the heart of the CARICOM claim. State officials are simultaneously invested in facilitating and maintaining friendly international relations with the same Western European states they are claiming reparations from. In this brief discussion of diplomatic maneuvers of Caribbean state officials today, I've shed light on one way in which demands for reparations take different rhetorical forms across scales by pointing out how a reparatory logic of debt translates to an idiom of development in response to Western European disavowal of material repair. In this example, the discourse of development is one of multiple reparative reasons. Next slide, please. The National Civil Society Organization, the Guyana Reparations Committee, has structured their advocacy for reparations around the notion that, quote, land justice is reparatory justice, unquote. In addition to preparing case material for the international CARICOM claim in 2013, the Guyana Reparations Committee, whose members are primarily of African descent, began crafting a national claim to redress in the form of an African Ancestral Land Rights Bill. Next slide, please. This bill requires the country's government to recognize Afro-Guyanese rights to up to 15,000 hectares of land in their constitution, the equivalent of about 18% of Guyana's total landmass. In the national context of Guyana, where the two largest populations are of African and Indian descent, followed by smaller indigenous, Chinese, and Portuguese populations, a claim to African ancestral land is a controversial claim. The African Ancestral Land Rights Bill is a communal claim to land, and as such, the legal object of the claim is comparable to existing forms of indigenous land title in the country. Next slide, please. Land title in Guyana is broadly distributed into three categories. 73% is state land or former crown land from the British colonial administration. 12% is privately owned, and 15% is communally held indigenous or in Guyana, Amerindian land. With regard to the latter, this means that all administration of land, categorized as indigenous peoples' land, goes through the Ministry of Amerindian Peoples' Affairs and the National Toshaus Council. Indigenous land rights policies are partially a result of the independence agreement between the UK and Guyana in 1966, including a revised Amerindian Act of 2006. Note that Guyana is the size of the UK, which has a population of 40 million, and Guyana has a mere population of about 750,000. Landmass is vast in Guyana. Unlike other former plantation societies, such as Barbados, Jamaica, and Hispaniola, also known as Haiti and the Dominican Republic, whose land was cultivable when colonial settlers invaded the area, the plantation system in Guyana emerged through a cumbersome transformation of the coastal landscape. In A History of the Guyanese Working People, 1881 to 1905, Guyanese historian Walter Rodney details how enslaved Africans excavated and drained 100 million tons of land to make the swampy coast of Guyana inhabitable. These historical facts give rise to a conviction, especially among Afro-Guyanese, that Guyana, as we know it today, and the land that is today inhabited, would not have been possible without enslaved labor. Next slide, please. In the words of a central member of the committee, quote, "It is not only the forced labor we performed under the whip that was never paid for. We planted the land, we grew the crops. Through the process of making inhabitable and using this land, we indigenized this land. The entire coastline was humanized by enslaved labor, and yet there has been no compensation for our labor." In the example I draw on today, the reparative reason of the Guyana Reparations Committee's ancestral land rights bill is structured around land. Next slide, please. This example shows how this structure around land galvanizes new questions about indigenizing, humanizing, and making inhabitable, such as, what does indigenize mean in relation to indigenous? How is humanizing comparable to making inhabitable? And these questions also bring me to think about what are broader international legal frameworks for descendants of enslaved in the Americas that do not self-identify as indigenous. What could it look like? What is the role of African indigeneity, or say Black ancestrality, in international law? These questions get at histories of racialized forms of violence, something that Howie Taylor, my colleague, also discusses, and how these histories categorize and give way to legal identities and existing forms of racial exclusion in international law. Next slide, please. Western European recipients of reparation claims may imagine and even agree to a moral responsibility for transatlantic slavery. The material and practical implications of reparatory justice for historical injustices, such as transatlantic slavery, however, are met with refusal from white Western European beneficiaries. Reparative reason as an analytical framework supports a focus on reparation claims framed within a larger logic of debt, but articulated through multiple terms related, for example, to development and land, as I have shown today. The term seeks to identify the entangled national, international, and transnational legal and political avenues within which claims to reparations circulate. As such, reparative reason seeks to place responsibility where it is due. Thank you so much. Back to you, Aparna.
Thank you so much. That was extremely illuminating. I think a great start for this panel. And I think a lot of the other papers, as we'll see, are discussing similar convergences and divergences between different reparative claims or reparative reasons. So just to ask a quick question, a preliminary question. In the paper, you discuss two different kinds of Guyanese reparations claims, which address two different kinds of injuries. The first, theft of national wealth or national potential, and the second, a theft of personal land and labor, people's and communities' land and labor. Are these two identifying for the people involved the same structure of colonialism, or are there competing definitions of the colonial past between these two reparative strategies? And just to clarify that further, are the two kinds of redress being sought possible together? Because it seems like there are often opposed agendas, development and indigenous people's rights, as we know, have been kind of in contest for a long time across the world. So if there were reparations towards national development to Guyana, to the government, could we imagine something like a push to take over land for developmental works, and then actually existing intention with the kind of the effort to redistribute land, basically? So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it certainly makes sense. Well, I think I will say, with regards to the development question, from what I'm understanding thus far, those initiatives would be thought of out on a more regional level, and they would come in the form of digitalizing different forms of archives, of public apologies. That goes more to the 10-point action plan of the CARICOM that has been discussed throughout this seminar, and whether any form of policies that would be enacted through such regional programs could potentially be in contest some of the more national development, or no national policies that are being called for in Guyana. I am not so sure, but I do think, especially because there is such vast land in Guyana, I can imagine that there is enough, at least land-wise, there is enough for all, one can say. But of course, I can see that it's political complications. But I think another complication that's especially salient in the context of Guyana is that there is a history of former enslaved persons buying former plantation land in the 1880s. Earlier on, 1830s. But a lot of the administration of that land is not very regularized. So there is an existing but separate question that has to do with regularizing African or title to land in Guyana that is not unrelated to the claim, the African Ancestral Land Rights Bill, but the particular land that is being claimed is in this bill is not former plantation land. So in that sense, I can see how there are multiple claims to a restructuring of land policies that may be in competition on a national level, yes. Or if not in competition, but then at least in parallel and require different forms of attention, yeah.
And that building solidarity would be a process of building. It would not be something that would be automatic. And yeah, I think this is something that we will probably come back to in Q&A too, because as I mentioned, I think this is a tension that's present in other papers as well. And so yeah, with that, I think we should, thank you so much, Anna. And I think we should go to our next speaker, who is Howie Taylor. Howie is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia. He is broadly interested in political, legal, and psychological grammars by and through which historical afterlives are reckoned with in the present. In his dissertation research, he focuses on the manner in which Germany comes to deal with transnational claims to repair colonial legacies of genocide, settlement, and white supremacy. His research is funded by the Wenner-Gren Foundation and the Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies, and he holds an MA from the New School for Social Research. So over to you, Howie.
Thanks so much, Aparna. This was really great, Anna, and I'm really excited to be here. So my talk is entitled "The Figure of the Jew and German Colonialism at Court." And my thesis, which I'm currently writing, as Aparna said, analyzes historically and ethnographically the question of how repair and recognition for histories of anti-Blackness, native dispossession, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism in the German context specifically are understood and managed in transnational locations, so in Germany, but not only. So my work took place specifically in New York City in the US, Berlin in Germany, and Swakopmund in Namibia. And I investigate these questions by looking empirically at reparations struggles for the aftermath of German colonialism in Namibia. My research took place in courtrooms in New York specifically, with bilateral negotiators in Berlin specifically, with politicians and with reparations and memory activists and those who oppose them. And what I'm going to present here is a work in progress, and I'm very much open to any and all comments. So in this talk, I want to suggest that when there is discussion of reparation and repair for colonialism and slavery, the figure of the Jew who is redeemed and indeed repaired after Auschwitz is never far off. There is then, I think, a necessity to investigate the effect of particular instantiations of that figure and the kind of harm that he or she is understood to have undergone upon particular kinds of reasoning with repair for colonialism and slavery. Influenced by and engaging with recent movements in memory studies, such as work by Michael Rothberg, I am also deeply animated by the question of the political and legal rationalities, or the reparative reason, as Anna Shirey has so helpfully referred to it, that are produced by very different versions of the story of the Shoah, the Jew harmed by fascism in Germany, and most importantly for my purposes, different versions of the story of reparations, repair, and what is sometimes understood by some scholars as redemption or the new exodus from Egypt, as some transitional justice scholars have described it, for what has become known as the Jewish people. How does the figure of the Jew in its various different instantiations affect the manner in which reparation and repair for colonial histories are negotiated, understood, and reasoned with in different settings, even if the presence of that figure is not always obvious? So I'm currently working to finish a chapter that deals with the New York City portion of my research, in which I observed courtroom proceedings where Namibian activists, specifically Herrero and Nama activists, sued the German government for reparations. And in this talk, I want to focus specifically on this and the various ways in which the legacy of the Shoah and the figure of the Jew appears in this context. So before I go into this, I just want to remark that in recent years, reparations activists and human rights practitioners alongside them have turned to domestic and international legal mechanisms to attempt to address and redress the international legacies of colonialism and slavery, whether through the successful lawsuits, recent successful lawsuits, such as the case against Britain concerning Mau Mau torture in Kenya, or the case against the Netherlands concerning the Rawagede massacre in Indonesia and what is now Balong Sari. These cases suggest new horizons of juridical accountability for colonial atrocity, if not for colonialism or settler colonialism themselves as structuring relations. So borrowing from writers such as Yukiko Koga, who's here today and who's written a lot of fantastic work on this, and Nicole Imler, who's also part of this conference, I think these cases can be seen as part of a contemporary process of juridification of histories of racial violence, in which courts, and often domestic Western courts, so not international courts, there aren't that many, are more and more involved in political questions that relate to colonial legacies, and in which activists often find themselves, as Koga has described, between the law. So what happens when a reparations claim for racial violence that is connected to both colonialism and to the Shoah, albeit in very different ways, is brought to Western courtrooms by activists from the global South, and in particular, in this case, to an American courtroom? And in this paper, I focus, as I've said, on the Jewish aspect, and that is the way in which Jewish history and Jewishness, or the figure of the Jew, appears in this case. But of course, this is just one element, and there are many ways in which you could analyze the case. So the case that I'm referring to here, and some of you will know it from the news, and some of you will have just come to it, is that of the Herrero and Nama versus the Federal Republic of Germany, which never went to trial. It was recently dismissed, but it saw a number of pre-trial hearings at the New York Southern District Court between 2017 and 2019. And I was in attendance at a number of these hearings, and I interviewed plaintiffs and lawyers, some of the plaintiffs. And I think this case enables an analysis of some significant tensions and questions when it comes to the dilemma of repair and reparation for both Black and Jewish suffering at the hands of European racial violence, even as it ostensibly has little to do with Jewish people and Jewish history. So before I go into this analysis, I just want to turn to the history that the case concerns. So this is just a summary of the history of the Herrero Nama genocide. So the Shoah, the Holocaust of European Jewry, was not Germany's only genocide, nor was it its only investment in racial dispossession and the production of race itself. While short-lived territorially, Germany was a major colonial power between 1884 and 1914, and Namibian, Tanzanian, Cameroonian, and many other African continental activists, as well as Afro-Germans, have been calling out German and wider European hypocrisies for many years, if not decades. Perhaps the most well-known moment in the history of German colonization, in the West that is the Herrero and Nama genocide, sometimes known as the Herrero, Nama, Damara, and San genocides. The majority of the populations of both the Herrero and the Nama people were murdered between 1904 and 1908, and Damara and San people were significantly affected by a mass extermination policy initiated by German colonial troops in alliance with settlers in Southwest Africa, now an independent Namibia, when the territory was a German colony. And they were also, by the way, strongly supported by the British, and you can't tell the story in a national frame entirely. The genocide was part of a wider settler colonial process in which indigenous peoples in Namibia were deprived of their lands and livelihoods, partially through a conception that we might know from the Holocaust of Lebensraum. Their lands were then forcibly occupied by white settlers, English people, Germans, Afrikaners, who dominated the country further under a decades-long occupation by the South African apartheid regime. These lands are still in white hands, in a country in which Black people live with differential gradations of sovereignty. And as Zoe Samudzi has recently argued, the genocide was part of a militarized German science, crucial to the emerging pseudoscience of eugenics that would reverberate across the world and that has had influences upon contemporary practices of genomics. And I just want to shout out the work of Manuela Baucher, who I think is here today, and she's at the former Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which is now the political science department, I think, at the Free University, underneath which human remains were recently found. And these legacies of imperial eugenics have not been adequately worked through in the German context. And there's lots of work that's starting to happen now on this. So Herrero and Nama skulls that were taken at the time to be used for scientific experimentation continue to sit in a number of European and American institutions today, not least the American Museum of Natural History, which is at our doorstep. This history of genocide in Namibia, as a number of scholars have been arguing for some time, inspired somewhat by the work of M.S. Césaire, has deeply influenced racial formations in Germany and beyond. And these effects have been consistently overlooked by Germanists, and they continue to be overlooked by Germanists. Their attention has been growing exponentially in recent years, and I think that's as a result of Herrero and Nama activism. So on that note, to the court case. Diasporic Herrero and Nama people from the USA, Namibia, South Africa, Canada, and Botswana sued Germany for reparations, restitution, and inclusion in bilateral negotiations in a class action lawsuit in New York City that took place between 2017, 2019. So it was about 2 years. They have sought and continue to seek reparations for the murder of their ancestors, the expropriation of their lands, and the use of their bodies for scientific experimentation. The case has enabled activists to bring transnational attention to this history in a way that may otherwise have been very difficult, and it has exposed the depth of German failure to take any kind of juridical responsibility in comparison to the way it has taken responsibility for the Shoah. For example, in the court case, in the courtroom, German representatives flat out denied the genocide, though in Germany itself, strangely, they kind of acknowledge the genocide in particular settings and at particular moments, arguing that they have a moral and historical, but not a juridical responsibility for this history. So on the one hand, they're willing to engage in forms of remorse and moral reckoning in churches, for example. On the other hand, they're not willing to engage with any of the pressures that came from the American courtroom, refusing until the very end to even acknowledge the existence of the case. And as one Herrero interlocutor said to me, why is it up to the perpetrator to decide their own punishment? And in my thesis, I undertake an extensive analysis of the court case. I look at the various elements of German refusal, the affects of waiting for the German government to arrive, the performance of paternalism that Germany's representatives eventually show, and the manner in which colonialism and genocide and the Holocaust get juridified in, colonialism and genocide get juridified in the legal filings. So I argue in particular that despite being a case that seemingly has nothing to do with the Holocaust and its legacy, the figure of the Jew, or has little to do with it, the figure of the Jew in various instantiations hovers over it, and it does so in multiple ways. So this does not mean to say that this case is first and foremost about Jewish people. Clearly it is not, and it should not be. But there are multiple ways in which the figure of the Jew appears. So what are these ways? So I'm going to talk through 3 of the ways in which this figure appears. Well, firstly, and perhaps most obviously, activists in the courtroom and outside repeatedly invoke the fact that they have not received any reparation, whether legal, political, or economic, for their history of genocide at the hands of the German state, in comparison to a community that is Jews, many of whom have become, in different ways and through different organizational forms, recipients of reparations, and who have received international support for a certain kind of deeply troubling and deeply troubled sovereignty. They ask why recognition of the Shoah and opposition to anti-Semitism has become German reason of state, while German colonialism and the structural anti-Blackness that came and that comes alongside it has been so readily ignored. So the second way, that was the first way, that kind of hypocrisy that's called out constantly. And the second way in which the figure of the Jew appears in this case is that the legal filings themselves speak about the continuity thesis. And this is the idea that broadly, and it's been argued about by historians in various different ways, but it's the idea that Settler colonialism and genocide in Namibia was deeply formative for the racial and political, scientific, legal, economic structures that led to the Shoah and also to the Romani genocide. So it's the idea that there's a material link at the level of scientific expertise, legal formations, practices of state, such as the Goering family or the eugenicist Eugene Fisher, that binds racial violence against the Herrero Nama people and racial violence against Jewish and Roma and Sinti people in Europe. So in this formulation, it's an act of racism to tell these two stories apart and to imagine that anti-Blackness, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Romani racism are so radically separate both in the present day and historically. So this theory of continuity, which is used in the context of the law, and the question is what happens when it's translated into legal argument, is clearly an incredibly important tool for activists to show the manner in which this case relates to the figure of the Jew, to the Shoah, and a move that has political power in a context where the Holocaust has become seen to be the crime of crimes. So that's the second link. The first being the hypocrisies that activists call out. The second is the continuity thesis between Black and Jewish and Roma and Sinti suffering. And then the third link, which I think is quite underexplored and which I'm trying to understand, is the link between the life worlds of the American legal system. So you might ask, why is this happening in New York? And that's partly because the US became a site by in which the Holocaust was partly adjudicated in the wake of the Cold War. And in order to understand Holocaust reparations, and indeed reparations for colonialism and slavery more generally, as people such as David Scott and Regular Ludi have argued, the context of the Cold War has to be understood. The first phase of Holocaust reparations took place before the end of the Cold War. The second after 1990, and between that time, there lies what I think and many people think is a gulf. And that gulf is not just a temporal gulf. It's not just a temporal difference in how reparations took place. There's something about the way in which the story of the Holocaust past that was told that shifted. So the story of what it meant to give repair to this community, to give repair to a Jewish person. And I think that's deeply influenced by America, by Americans, and by American legal scholarship. And one example of this is that the Holocaust often became described by American lawyers as a massive, and it's been described in many other ways, but one of the things I'm very interested in is how American lawyers partly described it as an exercise in asset stripping. So legal scholar Michael Basile refers, for example, to Deborah Sen, Washington State Commissioner of Insurance, who said, I quote, "The Holocaust was not only the greatest murder, but it was also the greatest theft in history." I'm interested in this and the ways in which this notion of the Holocaust as the greatest theft in history may come to influence, though certainly not determine, the manner in which the colonial past is narrated. Does the colonial past also come to be understood as the greatest theft in history, and what happens if this takes place? And how does such a framing enable or disable the possibility of justice for Black activists inside the American courtroom and beyond, whose oppression has for so long been ignored and undermined? So the third figure that is quite sticky that I'm trying to work through is this question of how American courts came to be so central for Holocaust reparations. So to conclude, if the Jewish victim repaired, redeemed after Auschwitz through the technologies that we are discussing of reparation and restitution, and the connected offer of Jewish sovereignty over our own territory has become the model or a model, then I think scholars of reparation might want to reckon somewhat with the multiple ways in which that process of repair is reasoned through by different actors and the effect that this has on movements for racial justice. This is clearly also deeply important in a context where the state of Israel has often been understood as a form of Jewish repair and redemption. And I would suggest turning on the news today to understand more about the problems of this notion. So it is to these fraught, but I think necessary questions about the ways in which the figure of the Jew is figured in reparation struggles when it comes to questions about reparations for colonialism and slavery that part of my research turns to, And that's at a time when many people are trying to think about how and whether it is possible to discuss the Holocaust, colonialism, and slavery in a single analytic frame. And I'm continuing to write about and investigate this, and I would appreciate any thoughts or comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Howie. This is I'll say just personally, an extremely timely paper to read, because as I've been talking with organizer and activist friends about the situation in India and how to ways to gain the attention of the kind of wealthy Western observer to whom we are all catering in the news and beyond. We have definitely faced the problem of the inability to speak to the West of any tragedy outside of the framework of Holocaust or genocide, or outside of that comparative, that comparison structuring so many other kind of claims of reparation, or just claims that are being made of redress. So this is an incredibly helpful paper to listen to and to read through. So I guess a preliminary question I have would be, given the exceptionality of the Holocaust in the constitution of Western public memory over the past half century or so, or longer actually, how have Namibian activists navigated the question of the exceptionality of the Holocaust, the capital H? How far does the continuity thesis go, or how far is it able to go, given the kind of given that they are observing the hypocrisy of the German government and of kind of international observers in recognizing one and not the other genocide? At what point does race and Blackness become something that actually punctures the continuity, or is that a strategic argument that is being made with kind of recognition that there is something about Blackness that is unrecognizable in the same frame? So that's one question. And then the other question I have, which is, you don't have to address both, but speaking of colonialism as asset stripping, and that American courts are the ones bringing up this framing of theft, that strikes me as, I guess, counterproductive for their own purposes, because if it's theft, then the redress in question must be the return of stolen labor, wealth, land, or whatever, of whatever it is that was stolen. So how are courts navigating this conundrum of of understanding something as theft rather than just as extermination, because extermination cannot be made right in the same ways that theft can. So those are just some preliminary thoughts.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to distinguish between the kinds of strategies of the lawyers in the case, of activists in the case, and then the worlds in which they're forced to bring the case. I've written elsewhere that there aren't very many arenas in which it would even be possible to bring such a case, and for many reasons, the American context makes that possible. And of course, by making the continuity thesis so central, there's a way in which there's an attempt to become assimilable into a certain kind of whiteness. And someone like Zoe Samudzi has talked about this a lot too, so I think it's important to say that. And there is a question of whether it would ever be possible for Namibians to be recognized and to be understood in the same frame as a result of anti-Blackness. Of course, that's the question that hovers over the whole thing. This question of whether, even if recognition were to be given, even if this were to be recognized, would it ever be understood in the same frame as the Holocaust has been? I also just think it's important to mention that, part of what I'm thinking through is that there isn't just one Holocaust. There isn't just one, yes, the Holocaust has become exceptional in the West, and that's true, but I also think the way in which that story is told in Germany is very different to the way that story is told in the US, for example. So these struggles in the German context look very different to these struggles in the American context, if you would bring a case such as this in a German courtroom. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to think through, which is that, of course, there's this sanctification of Auschwitz, and there's this Holocaust with a capital H, but there's also very different places in which that's being adjudicated. And there's lots of scholars in memory studies who've spoken about that, but I think that's also one of the tensions that Namibian activists are working with. Is like, okay, where can we go where this will really be heard? And in the US, when you think about how many Holocaust museums there are in the US, when you think about the way that story's been told in the US specifically, I think there's a reason why they've come to the US rather than, say, the UK. And I think that matters.
So the question is by Jonathan Park, who says, I'm curious about the relation between the figure of the Jew and living Jewish persons active within current German discourses around colonial repair. And what kind of connections have you seen between Herrero and Nama diaspora activists and Germany-based left Jewish activists, decolonial and post-colonial activists? And I think that, again, there are ways in which this question could apply to all of our speakers, and the kind of solidarities, as I was mentioning when listening to Anna's paper, between those in the imperial core trying to reckon with and advocate for reparations and those in the colony or post-colony. So Hallie, go ahead, and then if anyone else wants to answer.
Thanks for the question, Jonathan. Before I answer, I should probably say that I would also consider myself an activist in this context. So I can speak about these things both from a fieldwork perspective, but then also as an activist myself. And one of the things that a lot of people are thinking about now is this question of solidarity, and I think it's very timely. And one of the things I've noticed, so I did my fieldwork like 3 years ago, and I'm still heavily involved in these discussions. One of the things I've noted at that time, I think there weren't many Jews in Germany who were involved in these debates. I didn't feel that this connection between anti-colonial activism and the Jewish left was particularly strong. For most Jews that I know in Germany, there was very little interest, and I think that's changed in the last year or two. And people are starting to think differently. My sense is that people like Max, I mean, I haven't heard a huge amount coming out from someone like Max. There's definitely interactions between the Herrero Nama diaspora and German-based decolonial, post-colonial activists. Those interactions have gone back 20 years, like between Afro-Germans, Africans living in Germany. But between the Jewish left and the anti-colonial left, it's complicated in Germany also, and then I'll be quiet, because of the Palestine question as well, and that is a whole other thing that I won't get into now. But there's often a limit of solidarity when it comes to the Palestine question. I think that becomes very tough in terms of how to configure solidarity. All I can say is I think there needs to be a lot more. Yeah.
Olufemi, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a brief note on the solidarity question, which is really just to recall a point Howie made earlier in the presentation. The context is, I think there's a way of thinking about reparations that's very nationalist in the sense of squarely focused on group interests, and in a way that kind of avoids the hard questions that solidarity would pose. And I think in a lot of ways, the current actions, the current violent actions of the state of Israel, I think are a cautionary tale for that kind of politics, right? It just, you can have a legitimate historical grievance, but it still matters what happens to other people as a result of, you're getting your redress. So I think solidarity needs to, I don't think from a position of, from a standpoint of justice, solidarity is not an optional aspect of reparations politics, as I see it. And so I think that is important. So I just wanted to underscore that point of Howie's from earlier.
Definitely. So I think with that, I'll actually pass back to Anna, because I think we are at time. So Anna, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Aparna. And I find that actually Femi's question also addresses quite well the answer you posed to me after my presentation. So I appreciate that addition. So everyone, thank you once again. And I believe one final time, at least for this webinar series. The panel today and the series in its entirety has shown that the temporal has shown the temporal and spatial complexity of the subject that we have taken on to study, those of us who have presented at this series. And so, as usual, it is the case that we have raised more questions than answers. And nevertheless, we hope that some of the reflections that has been shared here today and during the other sessions has offered some kind of clarity or offered grounds for additional exploration or questioning about contemporary thinking on reparatory justice in the early 21st century. So we hope to be following up on this event in the future in one form or the other. We have not decided on how, either in the form of a workshop in New York or in the form of a special series. We're thinking within a 5-7 year time frame. That's the life of the academics. But so we will potentially send out an email to the list of registrants for this event in that regard. And for those of you that would like to unsubscribe to any future emails, you will be able to do so. And if any of you at this point would like to get in direct contact with any of our speakers or myself and Howie, the organizers, please reach out to us on opeer2020@gmail.com. Maybe someone will share the email in the chat. And lastly, you can find recordings of the events. Please also look out for a link in the chat box if someone would share, please. And we will share that information online as well. So please do look out for it. And I think that's it for today. Thank you everyone so much for being here. Thank you for the presenters and take care. Have a good evening or good afternoon. Bye.